Hi, I am Kelly, and this is Two Broads Talking Politics live. And I've got some returning guests on with me. So this is Jamal Holtz and Demi Stratmon from a group called 51 for 51. So hi, Jamal and Demi.
Hello, Kelly. Thanks for
Hello.
Yeah. Hi. So the last time I talked to you guys was about a year and a half ago, and I think you were both still in college, and I think you've both graduated now, right?
yeah. The, the,
Yeah, and
the, the duo has
Yeah.
graduated, and we're unfortunately adults now.
in the midst of the pandemic, yes, we both
Yeah,
graduated.
it's not all cracked up to me. Excellent, excellent. And so you are from, as I mentioned, 51 for 51. And so that is about DC statehood, one of my very favorite topics and something that a lot of people are finally starting to talk a little bit more about. So I want to talk some about that, but maybe for people who weren't listening before, you guys could talk just a little bit about yourselves. Oop, I'm going in and out. Sorry about that. Introduce yourselves. So Jamal, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about your background and why you work with 51 for 51.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly, for that. My name is Jamal Holtz, native Washingtonian, born and raised in Ward 8 of Washington, D.C., Southeast is what I love to call it. Graduated high school here at Friendship Collegiate Academy, attended college at the University of Rochester. Now I currently serve as a engagement specialist and leading out local engagement right here in Washington, D.C. at a community engagement firm, social impact firm called Link Strategic Partners. And I'm a lead organizer with the 51 for 51 campaign, Statehood campaign, really focused on getting statehood through a progressive form and eliminating the filibuster and passing it with a simple majority. And I've been with the campaign for about 2 years now. Is kind of when we kick things off with the plan. And I'll kick it over to Demi.
Yes, so good to see you again, Kelly, and for everyone who this is their first time meeting me. I'm Demi. I'm also a lead organizer and advocate for 51 for 51. Joined on the same wave with Jamal around 2 years ago when we could travel around the country, go anywhere we wanted to go, not fear for anything. And we were just talking to, at that time, presidential, candidates, talking to people in the community around the country about why DC should be the 51st state. And over time, this has become a leading story. So very happy about that. But like Jamal, born and raised in Washington, D.C., I'm a product of DC Public Schools. I went to Benjamin Banneker High School. Go Bulldogs. Then I just graduated last spring from Dartmouth College, and I studied government. Came back to DC to not only uplift the story of statehood, but also to contribute to just building my community in any way I can. So I'm here doing a lot of advocacy work and also just trying to do any type of form of civil engagement now.
Excellent. So I am so happy to catch up with both of you and to see how much excitement has built around DC statehood since we last talked a year and a half ago. So at that point, there had never been a bill passed in Congress. There was just sort of on the beginnings of, people had been working on it for decades, but just on the beginnings of trying to push this forward. So can you tell us sort of where we are right now? What's the state of play with DC statehood?
You want to take it, Demi?
Yeah, I can definitely start. So like Kelly, like you mentioned, back in 2018, the summer of 2018, we were just, we were seen as radicals in a sense, saying that it should be the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. Discussing the filibuster, we were seen as radicals and people with a very out there idea. However, now we fast forward. Granted, we're in a pandemic, but now we see that DC HR 51 was passed. Now we're waiting for the Senate to vote on DC statehood. Now we have a government led by Democrats. So we're in a very different space. And right now we're just waiting. We're hoping that we have all Democrats definitely on board, but also getting a couple of Republicans to acknowledge that this is a fight for civil rights, for human rights. And as we are in the midst of DC being in current conflict and uprising, and it's a hot topic and a hot location, just what DC statehood would mean for the residents here, and why is it important, and why is it a safety and security issue? Yes, but why is it also still the leading civil rights problem that we have right now in our country?
Yeah, and Jamal, do you want to talk some about what does it mean? What are the things that would be different for residents of DC if DC was a state? I mean, there's a lot of things, but what are some of the things that people who live in a state might not even think about being important?
Yeah, and once we get to that point and we start calling the state Douglas Commonwealth, I think the power will finally be in the hands of DC residents. The power will finally be in the hands of 700,000 plus people who live and work in this city every day and raise their families here. We can learn from Hawaii, for example, which was the last state to be admitted to the Union in 1959. Hawaii had a special state legislative session to create election procedures and organize special elections for the House and Senate seats. The state also passed a state government reorganizational act that established the entire government infrastructure. It was a long process, but it was purely organized by the people. And one of the things that we've been doing for years now in Washington, D.C. is getting those things already set up, right? We passed locally a referendum. We passed locally an outline of what it would look like when we're a state and how our government would be organized. We have all of the boots ready to run. We just need to put them on the grounds. We have the car ready to drive. We just need to put our seatbelts on it and get it going. And so what we're looking forward to, and what this moment is now, as Demi said, is to really highlight how we continue to talk about racial injustice. We continue to talk about civil rights. We continue to talk about human rights. But however, we're doing I like to honor Martin Luther King legacy right now, as he always say, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And what we see is an injustice in Washington, D.C., where 700,000 plus residents don't have access to their full democracy. And right now is our moment to get that done. So when we are that state, we have that opportunity to speak for ourselves, pass our own laws where we aren't constantly worrying about what is this congressmember from Florida going to say, or what is this congressmember from Ohio going to say about our laws, because they're our laws and no one else from any other state should control what we do. So that's what it's going to look like.
Yeah, so there are a lot of arguments in favor of DC statehood. I'm obviously strongly in favor. I've never understood why taxation without representation wasn't enough. Like, in addition to all of the other things, DC residents pay a lot of federal taxes.
Yeah.
And yet have no voting representation in Congress. So Eleanor Holmes Norton, of course, is the representative for DC into the House of Representatives, and she can introduce legislation and sit on committees, but does not have a vote, even when the things they're voting on impact DC.
I hate seeing my paychecks when all the taxes come out, but it doesn't reflect my vote.
Yeah. And as like Jamal said, as we are stepping into adulthood a little bit more now, it's really like we see it on our tags, but it hits hard now. It hits hard when you get paychecks and it's taken out, and then you're in the midst of, the conversation going on within the country, but you just always feel like my voice is not heard. I'm a part of the system, but my voice is not heard.
Yeah, it's kind of a thing. It's like everybody like, call your senator, or call your rep to vote for a stimulus relief. And I'm like, no, I don't have nobody to call, and I'm not going to help you call, because I'm only going to call your senator if they're going to vote for statehood. So it's like, it's that time it gets emotional, because it's like you want to be a part of this fight, and we are a part of this fight. We are constantly talking about access to quality healthcare. We are talking about access to quality education all the time. but it's like the advocacy stops at a level that we no longer have a voice in, right? So it's like, who's going to listen to a young Black kid from Washington, D.C. On the Hill if they know my voice doesn't hurt or harm them, right? If they're not worried about what the vote is going to look like because of my voice. So it becomes like I'm a runaround. It's like you use me on days like January 6th, you use me on days like the inauguration, but when it's time for us to use you and get your support, it's like we're not even thought of. We're like the last child.
Yeah. So what is the next step? Demi, you mentioned HR 51, which Eleanor Holmes Norton introduced in the last Congress. It was approved by the House, no problem, and of course went nowhere in the Senate, like a whole bunch of laws that were passed by the House. So what happens next? The House will have to vote again, since this is a new Congress. But what happens, assuming HR 51 is again passed through the House, which since Eleanor Holmes Norton said she has, I think, 205 co-sponsors of the bill, I think there shouldn't be any problem with it passing again. But what's the next step?
Yeah, so I want to piggyback off of what Jamal said, because I think that he really spoke to a lot of it. We're ready for the next steps, of course. We feel definitely a little bit better now with the state of the U.S. government, federal government. So we're just trying to prepare. We're trying to make sure that everyone is on board when we say this, and we're really making sure that senators know the story. We talk to a lot of elected officials. We have a lot of great messaging out there. We, like Jamal said, even though it's kind of sad and a little depressing that when we do reach out to these elected officials, we know at the end of the day, we're not their constituents. And that what we say is always taken with a little grain of salt, but we're still out there, we're still speaking, and we're even partnering with young people from their states, who are constituents from their area, to let them know that this is not just a fight for DC residents. Your constituents care about this. They want to know, why are you sitting here in Washington, D.C., allowing 700,000 plus residents not to have any say, but paying taxes? So we're making sure that messaging is out there and that we're connecting. So it's not a surprise if DC statehood, when DC statehood happens.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of, I just want to emphasize, there's a lot of bright minds here in DC. We have a lot of great, our local government is great as well. So I think, like Jamal said, we have this space, and we will have this space to see, how do we want to structure our government? What will our infrastructure look like? How will we change what governing Americans looks like in DC? This will be the first state with a majority Black and brown population. What does that look like? What does that mean for this country? So we're ready to define DC. We're ready to take charge for once, not be on the back burner, not feel like we are second-class citizens, not fear for our safety and security when we have protesters here who do not share the same values as the residents of DC. We'll have security. I cannot say that enough, because a lot of people ask, what does it feel like to live in DC, to pay taxes? It feels like you don't have security ever, in a lot of regards. It could be healthcare, it can be access to safety when we're going through a time like this. It can be feeling shorted through the pandemic, when everyone's getting state funding, and you know that you will not have those same privileges and luxury to get back started, local businesses falling, and not finding a way to make it happen. So it will be security. The next step is security for DC residents.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, of course, DC doesn't have senators to call, but probably a lot of people watching and listening are in states with senators. And so they should be thinking about that. My senators are both Democrats, but I'm still calling them to say that this is a priority. I know that they are in favor of it, but they need to know it's a priority for me and for the residents of Illinois that DC become a state. And so I think it's important for everyone who is listening or watching, if you are not in DC, that you are calling your representatives, you are calling your senators, even if they're already co-sponsors the bill, just to remind them that this is an utmost priority because it is such an important human rights issue.
Yeah, Kelly, and I would just emphasize what you're saying, to say, even if you look on the books and it says your senator or your representative is in support of DC statehood, you still need to call and say, like, we have you on the books saying that you support DC statehood.
Yep.
But when it's time to vote, we will hold you accountable because that means a lot too. Like we said back in 2018, a lot of people were saying things and had no picture in mind that we would get to this point. So when we're here and when now they have to act on their words, it's very important that we hold them accountable, and that we are there to let them know we're watching you on this decision. It matters to us. It's not something that we're just going to, flip the page and say, oh, okay. Like, no, it matters to us, and we will be here to see how you act.
And if I can add, I know a lot of people always ask, well, what does DC becoming a state have to do with me? How does that help me, right? Mm-hmm. And that's sometimes, unfortunately, how democracy works, or what it means to trade and tick for tat. But the fortunate thing is it's not just about what DC becoming a state means for Washington, DC residents. It's what it means for America as well, because when we talk about us not having a vote in these crucial conversations, these critical conversations around healthcare, when those things are on the verge of being overturned, women's rights to choose, when those things are on the verge of being overturned, the stimulus checks and COVID relief, supporting our small businesses, all how we spread vaccinations and all those things that affect not just me as a DC resident, but affects people all across America. Is the problem is that we always talk about, we were 1 or 2 votes away from passing this. We were 3 votes away from passing this. But little do they know that those 2 votes could have been Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. lost the voice and the vote in those fights. And I think when we do have those votes, it's going to be a day breaking, not only for Washington, D.C., it's going to be a day breaking for a lot of change, progressive change. And those changes are critical to moving our nation and our country forward. And you also talked about, like, what does next look like? We spent years, months battling and following presidential candidates to get them to support our plan for DC statehood. President-elect Joe Biden, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris endorsed DC statehood. And President Biden, I'm going to just speak it into existence. President Biden always talks about, not my president, but President Biden is my president. Always talks about the soul of America and how the soul of America is at stake. What January 6th insurrection showed us, it reminded us that the soul of our nation is still being fought over. Is that the soul of our nation is repeating itself, and we have a fight right now, and injustice happening right now. And that if we're really going to reflect the soul and the spirit of America, to reflect racial justice, equity, equality, and a true democracy, then we must really, really enforce and push Joe Biden to make this a part of his 100-day plan, and makes DC the 51st state in the first 100 days. Why wait to give residents, American citizens, not just DC residents, American citizens who are treated like second-class citizens, voting rights? Why wait 100 days? Why wait longer than 100 days than to give them their right that they deserve?
Yeah, and I think, of course, January 6th was terrible, a terrible moment, and we can talk about how terrible it was, especially for the people in DC. But one thing that has come out of it is that recent polls have shown that half of people in America now support DC statehood, which is a huge increase. 2 years ago, 2/3 of people said, "No, I don't think that's a good idea." So, half is still not enough, but is a huge improvement in polling. And I can't help but think if more people heard the story and knew about it and really thought about what that means for people who, you're right, are US citizens who don't get a voice in Congress, like it would have to be the case that a lot more than half would be in favor. And so I
Yeah.
wanted to ask, you're called 51 for 51, and you mentioned abolishing the filibuster. So what does it take for, the House is going to pass HR 51, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate, of course, is a 50-50 split right now. So what needs to happen procedurally for this to pass through the Senate?
Yeah. I'm going to take a stab at that. So one, we need to bypass the filibuster to pass DC statehood with 51 votes, right? 51st state with 51 votes. Mitch McConnell did it 3 times, bypassed the filibuster to affirm 3 Supreme Court justices. So if you can do that for party politics, you can do it for democracy. Especially if we're going to honor Dr. King's legacy on this important day, we must commit ourselves to rooting out racial justice in all forms. And what President Obama mentioned during John Lewis' funeral was that the filibuster is a Jim Crow relic that has set us back from achieving the things that we need to achieve to move democracy forward. So if we're really going to achieve these things that we're talking about and not let party politics get in the way of people's lives, because let's be frank here, people's lives are at risk. Like people day-to-day lives are at risk. And we saw that. I'm going to keep reminiscing back to January 6th because people day-to-day lives in Washington, D.C. were at risk. And we aren't talking about that. All we're talking about is the National Guard and how many military folks were in town that day. But we weren't talking or putting the people on the news who had to leave work early, the hourly employees who had to leave work early and couldn't get the rest of their money for that kind of shortchanged them on their rent for them. We weren't talking about the folks who had to sacrifice making a visit to the hospital or a sacrifice seeing their home health aides. My grandmother, for example, couldn't see her home health aide that day because of what happened on January 6th. We aren't talking about the kids who had to end school early and lose out on education in Washington, D.C. because everything that happened on that one day. So we can't keep pushing this back and making this a party thing. We can't keep talking about 2 more Democratic senators. Like, I'm frustrated here, so I'm going to say, who gives a damn about that? What we should be talking about is that 700,000 plus residents are losing out on their democracy. And those are the things we need to talk about.
Yeah. And can I just add that like I said, when we first came out here saying bypassing the filibuster, people called us radical. As Jamal just stated, though, it was not a big uproar when Mitch McConnell had 3 Supreme Court justices with that same process. And to also just comment a little bit on it's not fair, like that vote, 2 more senators. We hear that a lot. But right now, we have 50 Democratic senators, and they will represent 40 million more Americans than the 50 Republican senators. And adding those 2 senators from DC is just a start to making the Senate more representative. So when we talk about voting and number of senators and what is that going to mean in party lines, we really have to go in a level deeper and say, okay, who is representing who? What is the country's makeup? What are we discussing? Like Jamal said, what lives are impacted? I had people, family members, who wanted to get COVID tested, free COVID testing that was available in DC, which is very rare right now. And we can attribute that to resources. We can, go into that a little bit later, or in a different episode. But, I have people who tell me like I had to cancel my reservation for my free COVID testing because the city curfew started at 6 p.m. And booking, that puts people's lives at risk. We're dealing with a lot. So when the conversation about the filibuster and then number of senators and 2 extra senators for DC, that's not fair. It right now, the makeup of our country is not fair. And we're fighting that process. We're fighting for systematic change. And DC statehood is a part of making things leveled out, making things fair. And I just think, like you said, Kelly, if people knew about this and had the time to engage in the discourse and just take a time to go into the details, they would see like we're not tipping the scale. We're actually trying to level it out.
Yep. And Kelly, I know, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk too much here, but we're talking about the soul of America, and we're talking about party politics, and we're talking about those things that has really destroyed our country over the past few years. And to be quite frank, during this Trump administration, I had to write this down because one of my colleagues who I work with, named Josh Lasky, who's writing a book right now, one of the things that he said that is that Trump and his supporters have taken a shit in the bloodstream of America, and the country is in a septic shock, right? Is that our country is so divided right now and so shocked right now about everything that's been happening over the past 4 years. And January 6th kind of unfolded all of those things that has happened over the past 4 years, and really has left a lot of people in discouraged and shock and disbelief about where we are as a country. And so the first 100 days for Joe Biden, as we're talking about the soul of America, it has to be a focus on how we unite our country. And we can't keep talking about the party politics and who likes this over this, or who wants this over that, or what our response is going to be to this. We're going to have to focus on how do we heal America? How do we heal the people of America? And to hone it back into Washington, D.C. and statehood, 700,000 plus residents are healing, suffering from suppression. And we have to bring America together to make them realize the other 50% of people who may not support statehood, and get them to realize that 700,000 plus people, we're doing an injustice right now, and by not granting people statehood and their right to the democracy. So again, this is taxation without representation. If we're going to make this serious talk about racial injustice, then we can't leave statehood out of that conversation.
Yeah. All right. So action items for listeners and viewers is
Kelly,
obvious.
I had to take a breather from all. Sorry.
Yeah. So the action items, I think, are obvious. People need to call their senators. They need to call their representatives. They need to tell them that this is an absolute priority. It must happen. And I think also everyone everywhere has the responsibility to tell this story, of the people of DC, of this injustice, that they do not have representation. And so I hope that everyone will start just bringing it into every conversation they have. I try, it doesn't always come up organically, but when it does, really, really try to tell this story. I mean, I think back to elementary school, where we were taught like the whole reason for the revolution was taxation without representation. And the idea that we still have this in this country in 2020 is, it's not surprising, I suppose, given all the other injustices we have in the country, but it's just sort of mind-boggling that this is still a thing that only 50% of people support. Yeah. So I hope that everyone will do that. I am going to put on our website links to 51 for 51 on your social media, but also the text of HR 51 that was passed in the last Congress, because I think a lot of people sort of come up with all these practical questions like, well, what exactly will DC be, and what will it be called? And all of that is done, as you said. Like, we're past that part. That's all been figured out.
Yep.
Yeah, Kelly. I think that you're spot on to talk about it. And
Is she frozen for you too?
Yeah. Demi, you
That's
there?
what happens when you're fighting for injustice. The people that be, the powers that be, freezes your voice.
Yes, perhaps there's an NSA watching us. And oh, Demi, I think you're back.
You're
on mute, Demi.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know what happened. I was talking and then everything just stopped. I was going to say to talk about it. I think a lot of people have been talking about DC lately with what's going on with January 6th, like Jamal said, and even before that with Black Lives Matter protests this summer, and even before that when Trump did his big photo op in front of the church, and then, pandemic relief. I think DC has been in the news more than usual over this past year. I will say, instead of just everyone saying like, oh, like that sucks for them, like we feel so bad for DC right now, like I'm glad I'm not in DC. A lot of my friends like from school have been reaching out to me like, oh my God, like you're in DC, are you okay? Like that's a hot zone right now. That's what one of my friends texted me and said, it's a hot zone. Instead of just feeling bad, advocate for us. Make sure that we can have a voice and that this doesn't happen to us again. And how can you do that? You don't have to move here if you wouldn't like. We would love, DC has a great culture. I think you would love it. However, you just have to make sure that you're on the right side of history and that you're advocating for us in the ways that you can. And that's just not by saying like, that sucks, wouldn't want to be them. That's saying, hey, elected official, hey, senator, what's going on right now in DC is not okay. We want to protect them. They're American citizens that pay a lot of taxes. We think that they deserve better. And that is the huge action item.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I will say, as a mother of young sons, tell your kids about it, because kids just feel injustice. So they're like, that's not right. How can that be? And then they'll tell their friends. That's another way to spread the message.
Yeah. Kids repeat everything you say.
Well, Jamal and Demi, thank you so much for joining me. It is so great to catch up with you, and I am just thrilled with the movement that we have so far, and I'm really, really hoping that we can keep building this, and that, that DC statehood goes through. As we're speaking, there are 39 and a half hours until we have a new presidential administration. Not that I'm counting down. and with it, the hope for really healing the soul of the nation. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Happy MLK Day.
Yes.